We're standing here in the heart of Kyiv with Ambassador Ischinger, who will talk to us about Ukraine and the war here. Ambassador Ischinger, thank you so much for this interview with Deutsche Welle.
It's a great pleasure to be here and to be back in Kyiv on a sunny day. I'm delighted to see that overnight nothing serious has happened here in Kyiv. But we should always remind ourselves, even if we stand here quite peacefully, this country is at war, in a very ugly war of aggression. And that's why we're here.
You're completely right, and this is also what we can see in the background. And we've had many discussions during the past days about the war that is going on here. And one of the main issues right now is a discussion around the long-range missiles. So there is this big concern from Western countries about an escalation. Do you think this fear of an escalation is real? Or should the Western countries finally green-light the long-range missiles for Ukraine and Ukraine's military to strike on Russian territory?
Well, let me start by quoting, or at least indirectly quoting, Mike Pompeo, who spoke at this conference an hour ago. When he was asked a similar question, he said, we cannot ignore the risks. And I would fully share that. If you are a responsible leader, you need to take into account possibilities. So I'm all in favor of being cautious and considering the pros and cons very carefully. So I have sympathy both for President Biden and for Chancellor Scholz in Germany for trying to think this through as often as is required. Having said that, I am personally not in favor of these range restrictions. I mean, to tell the Ukrainians you can shoot like 50 kilometers, but you cannot shoot 100 kilometers, it just doesn't sound right. Let me make my proposal, which I made at this conference here in Kyiv. I suggested that an easier, and I think in terms of legal significance, much better and clearer solution would be if we demanded of Kyiv that any and all weapons that are delivered by us to them must only be used in accordance with international law, full stop. In accordance with international law. What does this mean? This means, for example, that Ukraine would be prohibited from striking a hospital, which is what the Russians have done so many times. That they could only strike military targets that, facilities, airports, etc., that have been used to attack Ukraine. That would be in accordance with international law. So I'm not sure that that will find a lot of support among our decision makers, but I feel quite uncomfortable when I think of the Ukrainian fighters, generals and soldiers who fight for their lives, for their country, for existential survival of their country, that they are being hampered by these rather bureaucratic sounding restrictions.
And that is something that you can clearly see at the front and at frontline cities. They're desperate to go forward, of course, and to win this war, but sometimes there's a feeling that they don't have enough instruments for it.
Yeah.
And then there's this famous slogan coming from the United States, now also being used by Europe, about "we will help you for as long as it takes." What does this really mean? Is this war going to last forever?
Here again, I would say, that this formula should be reviewed and maybe adapted. Maybe it would be a better version. Instead of saying we'll support you as long as it takes, we will support you with as much as you need, as much as is needed to end this war. Then you have a goal, a target, a mission, and not just a general sentence.
And regarding that thought, do you think the Western countries are doing enough?
I think the Western countries are trying to do more. They have recognized that they need to do more. They find it extremely difficult to fulfill their promises. Think of artillery shells and similar items. And I think that, if you ask me, I think we could also do significantly more on the front of, sanctions. There is so much sanction circumvention,
Avoiding.
companies avoid sanctions by delivering to third countries which are not following our sanctions regime, and then exporting the same stuff sort of indirectly to Russia, which can then be used for military or quasi-military purposes. So I think reviewing the validity and the impact of our entire sanctions regime is also something that merits attention.
How could an end to this war look like? I know that is a question that's difficult to be answered, but this war is going on already for more than 2 years. President Zelenskyy wants to present a peace plan to President Biden in the coming days. What is your opinion on that? How could a path towards peace look like?
Well, first of all, let me say I had a very interesting conversation with President Zelenskyy and his team yesterday, and I gather from this conversation that he attaches enormous significance to his upcoming meeting in the U.S. with President Biden and others, and I'm sure Vice President Harris and probably also the Donald Trump campaign. So the expectations are great, including on this range question, which we just discussed. President Zelenskyy apparently wishes, and I understand his motivation, to present his plan to President Biden first before it's presented to anyone else. So in the meetings that we've had here yesterday, today, we have not been offered any details about the plan, but what I repeat myself, what I think his level of expectation is that his peace plan, his conversation with President Biden will lead to progress, to acceleration, to greater capacity of Ukraine to defend itself. And I'm sure that if that happens in the US or with the US, Europeans will try to follow. So this is, I think, what happens in the next 10 days is going to be really important. And let me add one thing. For President Biden, these types of meetings are now part of his legacy question. He will want to go out as seen as a strong president, not as a weak president. On the other hand, he needs to worry about the voters. How interested are the voters in sending money to Ukraine? Apparently not so much. So there's a dilemma. But for him personally, I think the legacy question will be important. So I think for President Zelenskyy to go to the US and present these ideas to Biden, this is a very good moment to do it.
Interesting. One question on the US. The upcoming elections will be crucial also for this war. What is, for you, the worst case, best case scenario coming out of those elections that we could see regarding the war?
Well, first of all, regardless of who wins this election in the US, there is a consequence for Europe which we need to draw, regardless of whether it's going to be Trump or Kamala Harris in the White House. And that consequence is we need to do a lot more. We need to carry our ball ourselves instead of continuing to ask the United States of America to protect Europe. I mean, according to the farmer in Iowa, we're now richer than he. So why should he, with his taxpayers' money, support the military equipment, et cetera, of Europe? I understand this line of argument, which is why we need to do a lot more. And our debate in Germany, throughout Europe, that we are now just barely fulfilling the famous 2% goal is poor. We should go beyond that. We should all agree that 2% is the absolute, minimum, and that if we want to be taken seriously as Europeans, as an actor in a world of competing powers, in a world with less and less order, with less and less respect for international law, we need to be equipped for that. Not only in order to help Ukraine confront Russia, but in order to guarantee our own survival.
Ambassador Ischinger, if I may add a question to that, because you just mentioned a person in Idaho. Let's take a person in Brandenburg, because as you mentioned, Germany has a similar problem. How do you explain this? How do you make the people in Germany understand that it is important for Germany to take also the lead in a way in Europe for this war, that it is important to support Ukraine? How do you do that?
Well, first of all, let me remind you that no country that I know has had to perform such a complete 180-degree turn as Germany. As a long-time diplomat, I grew up in the 1970s and 80s with a policy, which is a firmly established policy. Never ever would Germany send weapons to an area of conflict. The fact that we are now, as President Zelenskyy remarked yesterday in my meeting with him, that Germany is now, behind the United States, the single biggest provider of military equipment to Ukraine, is really quite a miracle. It is a total change. So our government has performed this change. Not every citizen has understood why this is necessary. I do a lot of public speaking, public and not so public speaking throughout Germany, and I find that we have, as a nation, after unification 35 years ago, we decided wrongly that from now on, as Helmut Kohl used to say, we're now only surrounded by friends. Why would we need a military? Why do we need to think about deterrence? What is the use of nuclear weapons? Let's get rid of them. We don't need to protect ourselves anymore because we're surrounded by friends. All of a sudden now we find that that was wrong, that we're being threatened with nuclear weapons repeatedly out of Moscow, and that we need to prepare for the worst. And re-educating our publics, re-educating the German citizen that there is such a thing as deterrence, and that deterrence is not fighting a war, which is what I hear when I speak, but that deterrence is trying to take the best policy approach to preventing a war, to prevent our enemy or our adversary from attacking us. In other words, we are, if you want my view, we are at ground zero in terms of educating our own society about a world that is no longer a world where we're surrounded by friends, but we are now living in a world where there are active and massive and really existential threats, including military threats, to the very existence of the European idea.
Regarding the Munich Security Conference, there seems to be a new chairman, and it's Mr. Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO. How will this influence the character of the Munich Security Conference?
Well, I'm sorry, I have to tell you that we have an agreement that with respect to the ongoing office of the Secretary General of NATO, neither NATO nor the Munich Security Conference is at this time discussing this type of personnel issue. I'm afraid I can't go beyond that.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ischinger, for this interview.
Thank you. Thanks. Great.
Thanks.